Welcome, everyone. We're just taking one last minute to allow a few more people to join. So great to see so many familiar faces. This is the Telos webinar with Munther Isaac and Bill Haley, Voices from Bethlehem, the Other Side of the Wall. Okay, we'll get started. My name is Gregory Khalil. I'm co-founder and president of Telos. Telos, for those of you who don't know, is an American nonprofit that forms communities of peacemakers to heal seemingly intractable conflict at home and abroad. And historically, our main area of focus has been America's relationship to the so-called Holy Land, Israel-Palestine, which is the subject of today's call. For full disclosure, for many of you who don't know me, I have a personal connection to all of this. Much of my family comes from near where Munther's family is in Beit Sahur, Shepherd's Fields, which is right outside of Bethlehem. And I also, in a previous life before co-founding Telos with Todd Dethridge, who's on this call, I was a legal and communications advisors on the negotiations between Palestinians and Israelis, advising the Palestinian leadership. So I personally have a lot invested in a huge representation of my family still out there. So I'm really excited to bring this call to you today. In terms of logistics for the call, I'm going to give a little bit of a framing for the call, introduce our two incredible interlocutors, Munther and Bill. We'll have a conversation among ourselves for about 35 to 40 minutes. We'll then open this up for Q&A, and we'll be done at 2:15 Eastern time. So you'll all have a chance to ask your questions during this time. We are recording, so kindly note that. If you do have questions, please put them in the chat box. So it's Christmas time, Advent, Bethlehem, Israel-Palestine, this conflict. We hear a lot about these places, not just in the news, but also in our houses of worship. The reality on the ground for modern day Israelis and Palestinians, and particularly Palestinians, is quite harsh. And we're going to probably learn a little bit more about that during the call. Palestinians have been living in a state of dispossession for many decades now. And the title of Munther's book, which we highly recommend you get, The Other Side of the Wall, references one of the newer realities that Palestinians are experiencing, and that's the fragmentation and separation physically of their communities, not just from Israel, but from other Palestinian communities. With the construction of a wall that currently separates Jerusalem and Bethlehem, the birthplace of Jesus and the poles of the Christian story of birth to resurrection, and then the expansion of Israeli settlements throughout the West Bank and all of the accompanying infrastructure there. But within all of this, there are some incredibly hopeful stories that we want to encounter. And one of those stories centers on a difficult aspect of the conflict, which is the reality for Palestinian Christians, the oldest part of the body of Christ in the world. Of course, this is the birthplace of Jesus, and it's no surprise that some segment of the current Christian population there extends back to the very foundations of the faith. So we want to understand a little bit more about who these people are, how they fit into the larger modern day story, and we want to engage one particularly prominent Palestinian Christian voice, theologian, scholar, educator, pastor, and that's Munther Isaac. And then we're going to draw in an American counterpart, Bill Haley, founder of Coracle. And you'll get to know a little bit about Bill and this unusual friendship that has emerged over the last years. And through this, we want to explore some of these larger questions, not just what's the reality for Palestinian Christians, why is that so, what's the broader reality for Palestinians, Israelis in general, but what's our American connection to this? And while things look particularly bleak in this current moment for the people on the ground, are there ways that we can partner to help transform this story, to find some light in the current darkness? So with that, I love Munther, who's calling in from Bethlehem. If you could just give a little word from yourself, why you're on this call, where you are, and about your family, and then we'll get into conversation.
Good evening, friends. It's 8 p.m. here in Bethlehem, so I know it's good afternoon for most of you in the United States. I've seen some folks, good friends from Sweden as well. So I am Munther, and I'm from Beit Sahur, as Greg explained, just next to Bethlehem, known for being the shepherd's field, the place where the angels appeared to the shepherds when Jesus was born. So I am a Palestinian Christian from this land. I grew up here, and originally I studied civil engineering before sensing a calling to ministry. And so after I finished my degree, I went to the United States. I spent some time in Philadelphia. I studied at Westminster Theological Seminary. I returned from there to teach at Bethlehem Bible College, and I've been with the college since then, since 2005. Done my PhD work while teaching at the Oxford Center for Mission Studies, and eventually, I became the academic dean at the college. And a few years ago, I also received a calling to pastor the Christmas Lutheran Church in Bethlehem, kind of the main Protestant church here. And so in 2017, I added one more responsibility to my many others. So I pastor the church, Christmas Lutheran Church in Bethlehem right now, in addition to my work at the Bethlehem Bible College. And yes, I actually pastor another church here in Beit Sahur because, in our denomination, we hope for more people who get the calling for ordained ministry. And in my spare time, I'm a father, and my wife Rudaina is an architect, and I have two boys, Karam and Zaid. They are 8 and 6, and I'm very sure you will be hearing from them tonight. They never leave me alone when I'm on these calls. I try to explain, Daddy's working, please, but it never works. So let's see how it goes tonight.
Well, we look forward to hearing from them as well, adding a little life to this call. Bill, you're calling in from Northern Virginia and founder of Coracle. So tell us a little bit more about yourself, and then what brought you to this call and Bethlehem.
Yeah, well, thanks, Greg, and Munther, great to be with you, and great to see so many friends. I hope to share just a little bit of my story a little bit later. But just to say, I grew up steeped in American Christian evangelicalism and perhaps even fundamentalism. And so that was the air that I breathed growing up. And so there are some sort of clear themes about the Holy Land that you get from an environment like that once you get outside of the United States and get challenged a little bit. And so I was really graced in the mid-90s to spend 6 weeks studying in the Holy Land and having my perspectives challenged. And even way back then, I came back from that trip in the mid-90s saying, having seen all this, like, I'm pro-Israeli, I'm pro-Palestinian because I'm pro-human. And that was kind of how I came back to the States. And so when Todd in 2009, 10, or whenever it was, you guys started saying, hey, we're doing this thing that's about being pro-Palestinian and pro-Israeli and pro-human, pro-American, all that, it's like, man, I am in. And so I was really grateful to be able to be walking with Todd and Telos from the very beginning, in no small part because of my pain and sorrow over the plight not only of Palestinians, but Palestinian Christians in particular, who are my brothers and sisters, and yet are sort of a lot of Christians don't know that they exist, or B, don't know what to do with them. And so I have really been grateful over the last 6, 7, 8 years to go back to the Holy Land on a number of occasions with Telos, or whether it was just going to the Christ the Checkpoint conference and learning from Munther and Johanna and Salim and so many others. And I approach this conversation today as a learner in the presence of those who have so much to teach me. So yeah, so I'm delighted.
Well, thanks for joining us, Bill, and thank you to all of you for joining us. We have a very we have wide representation from around the world, apparently, and I just wanted to note that we'll have to tease out a lot of concepts given the different ways that we speak about this part of the world and the different ways that folks are involved. The majority of our work is with Americans, and particularly American Christians. And as a Palestinian Christian, I know Munther has had the same experience. I'm often asked, when did you convert? 2,000 years ago? When did you convert? There's this ignorance, but the real sort of representational sort of dominant view of how Americans see Israel is through a very pro-Israel Christian Zionist lens. It's not every Christian, it's not even every evangelical, but we've seen this with the Trump administration. So the question comes then from Munther, what's it like to be a Palestinian Christian and to hear expressions of fellow Christians from another part of the world which either ignore you or tacitly support the situation that you and your family are living under?
Yes, I mean, it is certainly, it makes things harder when rather than seeing understanding or experiencing understanding and at least sympathy from Christians, sisters and brothers around the world, it makes it even harder to experience what we go through on a daily basis here in Bethlehem. To survive here. Many years of conflict, many years of occupation, and at the same time, it makes it even more difficult for us many times, even Greg, having to explain ourselves as Palestinian Christians that those Christians that you hear about in the news with their strong positions supporting Israel don't represent us. And one of the things that continues to shock me over the years, and you're right, Greg, is the level of, and excuse me for being so blunt, the level of ignorance many Christian leaders have about reality here. But at the same time, that ignorance is coupled with strong positions about our land. And I wish people would just, before you make these statements about our land, just educate yourself about what is actually happening. And one of the things I also lament all the time is this fairy tale view they have about our land. It's as if it's empty. And then there is the myth of Jews returning to an empty land. Even the language that is always used in Christian circles about Jews returning immediately puts me as a Palestinian who's been living here for hundreds of years, thousands of years in this awkward position, as if I took someone else's land. But we've been here. So the language of Jews returning to an empty land in most Christians' mind, when they read the Bible and then think of this, they just assume that it was an empty, desolate land, and Jews were brought by God through a divine miracle to reestablish their presence here. And we just want to say, what about us? I mean, we exist here. We've been here. And right now, we are paying a heavy price. Something had to give when Israel was created. And it also creates some sort of a faith crisis to some, especially when we hear the language of God brought the Jews, or God established Israel, or this is a fulfillment of prophecy. It's one thing to have a theological position. It's another to, think that this affects us directly, because immediately we might think, why would God do this to us in order to fulfill a prophecy? Images of the conflict comes to our mind, and then we think, is God against us if we accept this language? So it's been hard on all levels, just on a daily reality, but then at the same time having to deal with so many diverse Christian positions. But what I would say unites them is some sort of ignoring our presence, our positions, and our reality.
And Munther, I think there's real irony in all of this, because of course the way that many people came to their faith in all of these other places is because your community passed the faith down from generation to generation under very harsh conditions, different empires ruling the Holy Land. And so to be on the receiving end of a different expression of that good news that you and your community have helped steward and shepherd for 2 millennia throughout the world has to feel a little bit indignant. And in some instances, like in your book, you recount the story at the beginning of the book where you're not even really seen as a fellow Christian by many Christians in the West. Can you explain a little bit more about why that is, and maybe share a story?
Yeah, I mean, certainly Christianity began in Bethlehem. I hope that doesn't come as a shock for people, and that the first church was actually in Jerusalem. The connection in the minds of so many people of Christianity with the Western kind of as if it's we beg to differ. Certainly, it's a universal faith, and we praise God for the way it spread, and we celebrate the diversity. But you're right in that one of the consequences today of the political nature of our world, where the world is divided into us and them. This is kind of, unfortunately, a global trend right now, this depolarization. And in that matrix, the way many Christians look at the Middle East is through the lens of us versus them, with the us being the good, the educated, the freedom, democracy, and the Judeo-Christian tradition, we're culturally superior and so on. And then being Arabs and Muslims. And to many, the fact that we're Arabs, Palestinians, but Christians is hard to deal with. And sometimes they reject us because of that. And certainly they reject us because we challenge the position and the narrative they have about Israel. But many times, Greg, even before we're giving the chance to express ourselves, we're put aside. The stories I mentioned in my book, and they're certainly not, isolated incidents, because these are stories that many of my Palestinian Christian colleagues, whether pastors or theologians, have gone through. Is how many times we've been invited to speak in conferences, mm-hmm. and then have the invitation withdrawn. And the one time that I will never forget is when there was pressure to withdraw my invitation to speak in a mission conference, where I was supposed to profile the Christian church here in Palestine and our ministry at the Bethlehem Bible College. And my invitation was withdrawn. I thought it was because of something I said, or because of a position I had. And I was a bit intrigued. Wow, I mean, do people follow me? And they answered me in a way that I'll never forget. They said, they don't know you, but it is because you are a Palestinian. And I let that sink in for a moment. And I hope we pause and think. This is a mission conference, Greg, mission conference, where my identity or nationality becomes an obstacle for me sharing about my situation. A mission conference in which we're supposed to reflect God's heart to all people. And I was not going to speak and challenge Israel or Christian Zionism even, just share about our presence. But for some people, the fact that I'm a Palestinian was a problem, and they tried to put pressure to withdraw my invitation. Sometimes it worked, the pressure worked. And that particular incident, it didn't. But in other incidents, and also in another mission conference, the pressure worked, and they withdrew the invitation, again under the basis that, it's you're Palestinian and it's hard. And I said, I'm here to read Bible studies. Nevertheless, it's just my identity. And again, it feels so strange to be from the place where Jesus was born, but somehow to feel unwelcome in many Christian circles. Because I don't fit well with their political narrative about this land, or even religious political narrative about this land. It feels so strange, and it feels so hard to be certainly discriminated against because of that.
All right. Munther, I recently saw a film that's new that you're part of, Till Kingdom Come, and this is a film about American evangelicals and Israel. And it's a really brilliant film, though the most difficult part, spoiler alert, to watch is there's a young pastor from Kentucky named Boyd who goes to visit Munther in Bethlehem. And Boyd is a really sympathetic figure, but he's a Christian Zionist and very avowed and sort of a fundamentalist view of Christian Zionism. And after his meeting with Munther, he says, I just didn't have the heart to tell him that Palestinians don't exist. And so I think it's this profound quote where it gets to something that's deeper than an ignorance of Palestinian Christians, and it gets to something deeper that we see through certain segments of evangelicalism in America and other parts of the world, which hold the Holy Land, Israel, in a particular light, that even when you're confronted with another human being, somebody from your own faith tradition, that your frame prevents you from seeing what's right in front of you, the human being, the person who's also created equal in the image of God. So Bill, I'd like to draw you in here because we have a diverse group of people on this call, including some people who don't really understand, not out of ignorance, but sort of failure for regular interaction, but what's an evangelical and why do American evangelicals, or do all of them, have this position? So I'd love to just get a little bit more of a sense of who evangelicals are, and also where you, as somebody who is political, or rather theologically conservative, orthodox in your beliefs in evangelical, where you fit into this debate within American Christianity.
Sure. Yeah. So an evangelical, a so-called evangelical, is a Christian who ascribes to a certain set of core beliefs about Christianity. So, for example, that the Bible is the inspired and inerrant Word of God, that belief in Jesus, like conscientious belief in Jesus, is necessary for salvation. There's a lot of importance put on personal holiness, personal piety. And then very significantly that a Christian is under profound amount of obligation to evangelize, to share the message of Jesus to others. And then I would say lastly, this would be true of all Christians, that Jesus is going to come back one day, and Jesus is going to make everything right. And that matters. That matters in this discussion, actually. So I might have missed a point or two, but American evangelicalism is sort of a softer version of American fundamentalism. But American evangelicalism has been profoundly shaped by a somewhat small theological movement in Britain in the mid to late 1800s that popularized a theology called dispensational theology. It never really caught much hold in Britain, but it really caught hold in the United States, particularly amongst conservative Christians. And so this theology gave rise to a certain set of beliefs that about many things, but then specifically about Israel, that became for a number of these people sort of the air that we breathed. And so I say the air that we breathed just because this is the air that I breathed growing up. And so I think that can be helpful to talk about what is Christian Zionism and how does it work itself out in sort of an unconscious assent in the life of a regular Christian who might not know otherwise. And it's worth noting that obviously the evangelical church is it's a lot of people with a tremendous voice, and as we've seen in these last couple of elections, tremendous voting bloc. So it's whether one likes them or doesn't like them, it's a voice that really matters in American policy. And perhaps particularly as it relates to Middle Eastern policy. So when I was growing up in Wheaton, Illinois, which is an important place for this particular movement, here's what I was taught, and here was the air that I breathed. I had no occasion to think of anything except this. These major points went something like this, and Munther draws these out in the book. So one thing it was assumed was that the Jewish people who live in the state of Israel are entitled to the land and to live on it exclusive of other people because God gave it to them in the first place. It's just an assumption. And then secondly, the creation of the state of Israel in 1948 was a really handy way for the Christian God to bring the Jews back to the land in order to fulfill apocalyptic prophecy, which is we're really close to seeing realized the whole way. Right? It's going to happen soon. And that the state of Israel was God's tool to get the Jews back on the land so that Jesus would come back. And then another tenet was for those who lived on the Holy Land prior to the creation of the state of Israel, if there were actually anybody living there, and that gets to your point, Munther, the story you just shared, well, too bad for them. I mean, too bad. And they're Muslim anyway, so they would be much more content in an Islamic country. They should just move, right? And the Jews are being given back to them, which had been stolen in the first place. So, just no recognition whatsoever of Palestinians and certainly of Palestinian Christians. And then the last point of this is the air that I breathe. It's the air that many, many, many people breathe still, that American support, both politically and militarily, of Israel is really important. Because if you don't support Israel, then God won't support you. And so that gets wrapped up with sort of end time prophecy and Christian nationalism. And again, the irony here, the irony and the sadness is that most of those folks have never set foot on the soil, actually. So I don't know if that helps, Greg, but that's kind of an overview of the evangelical movement as it relates to Israel and Palestine.
It's really helpful, Bill. Thank you. And I think for those calling internationally, as well as many Americans, you will have seen during the Trump administration just how prominent
Yes.
The segment of evangelicals who believe in some version of what Bill just laid out have become.
If I could just pause on that, Greg, and interrupt you, it's this population that is the reason why the embassy moved from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. I mean, this is the voting bloc that got that done. Such a significant development. It's because of American evangelicals and the desire to make sure that they continue to vote for a particular administration.
Right, and even beyond sort of the move of the embassy to Jerusalem, the discontinuation of support for humanitarian causes in Palestine and beyond, like Palestinian refugees, and then support for the movement of Israeli settlements, which have expanded in their fastest rate in history over the last few years, and have even received some quote unquote legal support from the United States these past years. So Munther, that's got to be a real sort of just disconnect, incongruence, if you will, to see that Christians in the United States not only aren't even listening to you, not seeing you as an equal human being, as a fellow image bearer, but they're out actively supporting causes that trample on your and your community's human rights. So could you tell us a little bit more about just sort of who the Palestinian Christians are, and then how in this toxic, dark mess in which you have very little power and your voice is marginalized, how are you cultivating a different narrative? What are you doing within your community, and what are you asking for those of us who have come to hear a bit of your story and want to know more or want to stand in solidarity? How can we grow a different posture and a different way of reacting to this seemingly intractable problem?
So yeah, I mean, whether they ignore us or not, I mean, they do ignore us and give no regard to our presence, and sometimes put our presence in danger. At the end of the day, we're here, we exist. I mean, we're not going anywhere, and we will continue to be here because this is home. So who are Palestinian Christians? We're part of the Palestinian people, this geopolitical place in the Middle East we call Palestine, others call Israel, and we have to find ways to coexist somehow. But we have been here, anybody, as a Palestinian people. By the way, historians have shown in a clear way that there has been a Palestinian subconscious as old as the 11th and 12th century. I mean, people refer to themselves as Palestinians. By the way, I wish I could tell Greg way before America was created. It's interesting that, if in their mind, they deny us the right to self-identify and think, and it's not as if we invented this thing, oh, we're Palestinians. We've been calling ourselves Palestinians for a long time. And as part of the Palestinian people, there has always been Muslims, Christians, and Jews. And some certain areas we coexisted well, as other times we didn't coexist well. Since the 7th century, Islam has been the dominant player in our land, and certainly the majority. Gradually, they became the majority. But despite that, we survived. I mean, up until the beginning of the 20th century, before the State of Israel was created, we were almost 12-13% of the total population. So there was a strong presence of the Palestinian Christian for Palestinian Christians. Yet sadly today, after years of conflicts and difficulties, we're less than 2% in the total population of the Holy Land, Palestine and Israel. But we're here. Some of us, the majority, belong to the traditional Orthodox Church, the oldest church here. We have many Catholics, and I would say 7 or 8% Protestants and evangelicals. What I thank God for is that, one of the things we say here is our impact is not measured by our numbers, but by our presence and witness. We are, despite everything, a very active and engaged community. We are an integral part of our community, the Palestinian community, and at the same time, a strong voice for peace between Palestinians and Israelis. We have always, been strong in educations, in schools, in hospitals. We have many organizations. We have many theology movement, Bible schools, universities. When I think of, for example, our small Lutheran community in Bethlehem, we're few hundreds, but from our church, we have, connected to our church, we have a high school of more than 400 students, 70% Muslims and 30% Christians, and we have excellent programs. We have a university college that my predecessor, Reverend Mitri Rahib, started. We have a cultural center. We have theological conferences, and that's just one example of one community. So we are a very, I would say, outward community. We're as a Christian community, we're very engaged in different aspects in our society, and that's what I hope people talk about in the news. We're not used to these stories. We're not used to sharing about the good things that are happening in the land. So yes, at the one hand, Greg, we feel, honestly, we're angry about how many Christians look at our land. But at the same time, what I wish to communicate is that there are many good things that are happening. We're doing so many good things, whether it's, as I said, in education or peace initiatives, interfaith initiatives, Bible schools, literature, women empowerment, and so on. So small numbers, but big impact in our community.
Yeah, and it's enormous impact. And also, I think, just to name the obvious, keeping the community alive and there, and the rich traditions. I know when I visit, and many Western Christians or foreign Christians don't understand sort of the full vibrancy of life there among the communities and the families and the different foods and traditions you have through the Lenten season, through the Advent season, that date back many hundreds of years. And it's beautiful to see that resilience. At Telos, one of the things we've been focusing on recently is giving more substance to this concept of peacemaking. So peace can sound very ethereal, kumbaya, like, can't we just all get along? Yet Martin Luther King Jr. said, peace is not the absence of tension, but the presence of justice. And so one of the things that we've been thinking about is, what does it really mean to actually make peace? And we've articulated these 6 principles and 6 practices of peacemaking that some of you may find helpful, and I'm sure David or Sharon will drop in the chat box below. But a key principle is that authentic relationships across lines of difference fuel transformation. Encountering the other can be problematic oftentimes, but it can also open the path towards different narratives and different futures if we come with a shared telos, or ultimate objective, which is working for a more peaceful and just future. So Bill, I'd love to know just a little bit more about how you got connected to this story, and and how you got connected specifically to Munther, and what this transformation has looked like for you as an evangelical pastor, coming from swimming in this world of prophecy and Christian Zionism to this new outlook that you have both on this region and on your faith.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. My first experience of the Holy Land was odd. It was in 1989, and it was not in the Middle East. It was actually at Auschwitz, where I was able to visit there and see the horror of the Holocaust and realize something was horribly, horribly wrong. And there was a sense in which, the horror of the Holocaust married well with certain tenets of Christian Zionism to just make sort of an airtight case that, like, Israel is for the Jews only, period, full stop. And so but then in the mid-90s, I was again in another place, and I was in Amsterdam, of all places, and I met Alisar Nabali. Alisar was a type of person I didn't even know existed, and that was not only a Palestinian, but a Palestinian Christian. And actually, she was in Amsterdam because her family had been displaced during the Nakba and had to flee. And so she told me about the history. She told me about the stories. And I had never heard this. I'd never heard this about the Palestinians, first of all, and I had never really met a Palestinian Christian. And so then by the time I was to go to Israel, not that much later, my sensitivities to the plight of the Palestinians had been created because I met a real person. And boy, she was amazing. She was a beautiful Christian lady. She was strong. She was funny. And I could not deny her presence or what she represented. And also could not deny that something was horribly off, in the history of 1948. Even as much as I could understand some of it, still something was very, very off. And so, and then when I was in Israel during that 6 weeks, and I was able to, I'm sure I interacted with Bethlehem Bible College and perhaps some of your colleagues there, Munther. But it just, what I came to realize, and ever since, and only more strongly since having gotten more involved, is actually, and this is where I would like to talk about, what is a Palestinian Christian? So that's a question for Munther, but I would actually like to answer it for myself as well. And that is this: I've learned a long time ago that if you want the deep truth on something, you learn from those who have suffered or those who have sacrificed a lot. Like they are the carriers of the deep stuff. And as it relates to the Christian faith, I look to Palestinian Christians, even as I look to African American Christians, as those who actually know what Christian faith is all about in ways that I don't. And so I have come to really appreciate the example and also the teaching of Palestinian Christians because they get Christianity in ways that I don't, in ways that I need to if I'm going to faithfully follow God. This whole command of, quote, love your enemy. I actually have very little to say about that. But there are, my Palestinian brothers and sisters who can teach me a lot about actually doing what Jesus had to say. And not only that, but I would say that Palestinian Christians represent some of the most powerful agents for actual peace in the Holy Land, specifically because of their adherence to the teachings of Jesus. Both in terms of the emphasis on justice, also on nonviolence, also on forgiveness, also on community. So I guess my journey started with awakening. Oh my gosh, Palestinians exist. Palestinian Christians exist. What do I do with that? And it moved to, I would call it sympathy. Oh gosh, they have it so hard, right? To sympathy mixed with outrage, I would say. But it's come to a place of profound, well, of course, sympathy and outrage always, but it's come to a place much more of profound appreciation and respect. I tell you, when I remember every time I'm with Johanna Catenaccio up in Nazareth, and Munther, this would be true of you as well. Like, I just don't feel like I should even be in the same room. I don't feel worthy. Such is my respect and regard for these, my brothers and sisters, who are actually showing me what Christianity is, because they're loving while under the heel and not resorting to violence. And boy, doesn't the world need that now. So I don't know if I answered your question or not, Greg, but
no. Beautiful. And I love that you began by starting with referencing whose perspectives we should pay more attention to, and particularly those who have suffered and those who have sacrificed. One of the principles of peacemaking that we arrived at was something called center the leadership of the marginalized. And while we all have important perspectives that must be shared, there's a tendency in these situations, whether it's in the Holy Land or here in the States or historically in all sorts of asymmetrical situations around the world, where those of us who have some privilege and have some agency, we think we know how to fix things. And so we ignore voices, or we come in and we parachute in, we want to be heroes, instead of actually listening to the voices of the people who are paying the price and carrying the burdens and really understand the nature of the problem that we're trying to supposedly transform or remedy. So Munther, I wanted to come back to you on that. Is you shared some beautiful things about the vibrancy and vitality of this Palestinian Christian minority community today on the ground. And yet we're in this struggle where so many of us on the call come from these communities that are actively, unwittingly or wittingly, authors of this untenable, unjust reality that your community is sustaining right now. How can we follow you and the example that you provide to write a different story, or to use what you say in your book, our prophetic imagination, to author a different reality going forward?
Yeah, no, certainly. Thank you, Bill, for your words. And I just want to say that it's not easy. I wish we get it much easier. It's not easy to live out your faith in one side with 99% Muslims occupied by Israelis, on the other side, a Jewish majority on the one side and a Muslim majority. We're Palestinians. It's complicated here. And certainly difficult. It doesn't come lightly. You talk about the question of loving the enemy. I wish people understand how difficult that question is in our context. I wish people understand how much, I personally struggle, and how many times I thought about it without, in myself thinking, am I really buying this? Let's be honest, it's hard. And it certainly takes lots of growth and codependency on one another. I thank God for people like Johanna Catenaccio. I've learned so much from him, and just him standing next to me and so on. I'm grateful for the opportunity whenever to share this wisdom. And especially with other, in my book, I talk about the story of, how many times people email me as a dean of the Bible College offering to come and teach from the West. And one particular request was so hard to believe, someone from Canada offering to teach us on persecution. And I suggested that he comes and learn from us rather than he didn't come back. Not that we are persecuted, but that, I wish people have the humility to learn from one another and not just come with the perspective, we want to educate you on things. And to answer your question, Greg, it's Advent. I don't know if you celebrate that in Advent. I come from an evangelical tradition, by the way, but now I pastor in a Lutheran church, and I had to learn about Advent and all these beautiful seasons. I love the Advent because it's time of waiting, and in waiting, you have to know what you wait for, and that's where hope shapes the way you live. What you hope for is what becomes our mission? For me, that's the idea is, we have to dream of a world that is radically different than ours. And to me, that's what keeps us moving. That's what keeps us going on. We're not happy with the world as we see it, and we don't have the luxury to ignore the suffering around us because we're part of it. We don't have the luxury to simply enjoy our Christian experience and thank God for heaven, because we might choose to do that in church, but then leave the church, and reality strikes us everywhere. So to me, in the idea of you have to be first troubled by the reality of our, you have to be broken by what, and we have to lament, and from our lament and brokenness about what we see around us, from not just wars, hatred, rejection of the other, you have to imagine a better world. And that's, I believe, what the prophets help us do when they draw these beautiful pictures that I love to preach about every Advent, about the lion and the sheep sitting next to one another, about the house of the Lord, and about people coming from every nation. That's the idea. And in our context, we have to dream about sharing the land one day as Palestinians and Israelis. We have to dream about a life without occupation, about a life without discrimination, about a life where people have the same rights regardless of their faith, their religion, their ethnicity, their nationality. I have to dream about, I will not accept the wall as a reality. It's as simple as that. Because if I do, I have, I will then surrender to despair and maybe go to violence or leave the country. I don't see any other option. But we cannot give in to the reality of the walls. We have to dream of a wall, of a reality without walls, without checkpoints. And I think that, there's something profoundly Christian in that experience, in that, this is what biblical prophets did. And this is what I believe our role is to do, to help our people believe in that reality. And because we believe in it, we will work for it. And one more reason, Greg, sorry I talk too much, why I love Advent is because as I remind my congregants every time I preach about it, that we don't have to wait for this, because the divine intervention has already taken place in our land 2,000 years ago with the birth of Jesus. He has shown us the way. And it might sound strange to say that, but in his kingdom that he established, the principles of that kingdom, we have the way forward if we truly believe in it and accept it. So yeah, call me naive, but I believe in these principles, in these ideas, and I'm going to continue to promote them and preach about them and help my people believe in them, because that's our role, and that's hope to me. And as I said, that's what keeps us going forward.
Well, I'd like to, on that beautiful note, I'd love to invite people to ask questions. I see one coming in already, and just reflect back, Munther. I think one of the experiences when we were able to travel, and hopefully we will be able to do it again, but one of the jarring experiences, I think, for many pilgrims in the Holy Land is just seeing all of the crowds of people everywhere. And I think sometimes it's nice to take a step back, and we see these divisions among all of us, this deep polarization, as you say, Munther, and divisions among Christians and people of different faiths. And then when you're at the pilgrimage sites, what you realize is that there are millions of people from all sorts of different backgrounds who don't even think the other person is a Christian, yet they're there authentically. They're there drawn to this place because they truly believe. For many, their only international trip. And so there's something deep that's motivating and bringing people together, and there's great opportunity there. Just as looking on this call, not to make too loose of an analogy or a leap, but we've got people from around the world and dozens of US states on this call who legitimately want to help participate, not in just sort of your prophetic imagination and follow your lead, but to be hands and feet to this as well. And so there's incredible opportunity that we have in this dark moment of waiting, and don't want to make light of the darkness that you and your family and people are living under right now, but there is a possibility for something different. And I'd love to draw some of these questions in. So we have 2 questions. I'm going to start off with Ben Norquist. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question? And also, you're referencing the Till Kingdom Come movie that we spoke about earlier, right?
That's right. Yeah, so for those who haven't seen the movie, Boyd is the pastor from Kentucky who, Christian Zionist, and Munther and Boyd sit down for a conversation in that movie, and it's over before it starts. I wanted to hear more. So I was just really curious, Munther, what else did you talk about with Boyd? It strikes me that there's symbolic power to what you would tell him, because it's the same thing that you might say to other American Christians who are generally pro-Israel and who don't understand and who are politically, set against Palestinians. So I was just curious what else you might have told him, and then also curious if there's anything that he said that struck you as new, or as a new, that maybe gave you a little bit further perspective into Boyd and his perspectives.
Yeah. So I'm actually curious whether the film made it to the US market or not, but I don't know where people can watch it. It's a very recent movie, documentary that spends almost 2 years with this pastor, a very hardcore Christian Zionist pastor, and I am the only, of course, alternative voice in the film. But yeah, it's interesting that our encounter in the film is 3 minutes. The director, who I became good friends with, she's an Israeli Jew. She said that that's by design, that she wanted that 3 minute to be the center kind of conversation. In reality, we spoke for more than 2 hours, and it's all filmed. So how it is in documentaries, they film you for 2 hours and then it's just these 2 minutes. We talked about everything, Ben. We talked about biblical interpretation. We talked about politics, reality on the ground. I explained how it is for us here as Palestinian Christians. I think what struck me the most from our conversation is that he came with strong suspicion. He wouldn't buy anything I said. To him, I was just, repeating things, or, he didn't come with genuine openness to understand. And I think that comes from the perspective that he must be right. We are 100% right. And how I see that is reflected. One of the things that, I don't get angry very much, by the way. People who know me know I'm very relaxed, and but it's seldom that one of the things that do that to me is when people debate politics and the reality in Palestine, and they are in America, they've never been here, and they think they know my situation better than me. It's one thing to discuss biblical interpretation, we will disagree. But what we cannot disagree is my experience. This is my life. This is my reality. And they try to tell me, no, that's not true. Palestinians are not persecuted. They're not, you're not oppressed. Are you serious? I mean, that's my life. So that's what, that's what I said. And going back, actually, Greg, when he said there are no Palestinians, it's that mentality. He is denying me even the right to self-identify. Of course, as an American, it's perfectly fine to create this American idea and nationality, and now America but we cannot do the same as Palestinians, because somehow we're less. And that's what I hope to challenge more. Are we equal? And I sadly, I don't think we are equal in his eyes, even as sisters and brothers in Christ.
Thank you, Pastor.
Yeah, I think that's so often so much of the problem that we face is this, flippant aspiration to equality, to say that, oh, everyone's equal. But in reality, uh, reluctance to actually see difference that convicts us and implicates us. And so often I think whether it's with some Christian Zionist or in other issues, that the problem is essentialized down to, well, this is working for me or this fits my vision, so I can't even allow myself to see a different reality. But I want to draw some other questions in, and I'd also like to let our folks know that we're going to steer the last 15 minutes of the call a little bit, not just to your questions, but to some practical things that we can do. How can we learn more? And then how can we become active? And so we have a diverse group of people on this call, so we may want to have several suggestions, but I don't want to leave this call without having some practical steps for us to participate in this prophetic reimagination. We have a question from Fahed Abu Akal. Would you like to unmute yourself and briefly ask a question? He's also a pastor.
When you are over 50, you don't remember what you ate yesterday. What was my question?
I didn't know. You had a question about the solution, but if you have any question
my question was basically right now to both of you. We have 50% of the population Israeli Jews, 50% of the population are Palestinian Arab, Muslim, and Christians. The old ways, I eliminate you and you eliminate me. What you going to do with 50%? I mean, today the Israeli military, with the support of the U.S., say to 50%, you do not exist. What is your merciful solution for coexistence?
Thank you, Assis Fahed. That's why, to me, true peace begins when we accept the existence of the other, the experience of the other. The way I phrase it in that the land belongs to God, but we belong to the land. And it's not my land, it's God's land. And as I say, I belong to it, I have to realize that others belong to this land as well. Our problem, for example, with whether it's Christian Zionism or Zionism is when it becomes an exclusive ideology. So our response to any exclusive ideology is not to fight it with yet another exclusive one, but to promote the idea that we should all belong to this land and welcome one another. That's, again, the vision of sharing the land one day. So we must promote these ideals of not just justice, but equality. But at the same time, let's not be naive, because this is not what we have in the land. We have a reality of one country controlling the other. We have the reality of the occupation. And in the state of Israel, the nation state law, which clearly and constitutionally discriminates against non-Jews. So we have to challenge that. And we have to, you mentioned peacemaking, Gregory. To me, an important element of peacemaking is speaking truth to power and challenging and calling things by their name. And so we cannot say, we're Christians and pray for peace if we're not willing to challenge the occupation, the military occupation of the Palestinian land and people. So there is something that churches can do, and you have to, at the one sense, I gave up on politicians on changing things, but at the other, you have to, push on those you voted and to pay attention to not just the suffering of Palestinians, but to the reality of the occupation, that is the core issue that must be dealt with. We cannot talk about coexistence and accepting the other until we get rid of the occupation. That's my conviction.
And as Bill highlighted earlier, when we're sort of discerning what our role is to play, how are we implicated, the reason for the embassy move, the reason for so much of the politics that we see has been catering to very vocal voices from certain segments of the evangelical community. So just as these voices are vocal, perhaps there could be a different voice that becomes more vocal and that is not afraid to not only speak truth to power, but to build power to actually change how that truth is received. So Bill,
and I hope, Greg, that is done in not just as Christians, but in an interfaith way, because we have to, Christians, Jews, and Muslims, we have to unite in this. I believe we have to show that faith can play a role in peace and in bringing people together. Right now, many times people ask us, even here in Palestine, even from our own community, haven't you given up on religion? Didn't you see that it's a source of all problems here? I'm convinced that true faith in God who loves all equally can really bring peace to this land. And so, yes, let's have these inner faith alliances, Christians and Jews, or Christian Jews and Muslims, to promote peace between and the end of the occupation.
Right. And with those from no faith at all who are simply committed to
equality. Absolutely.
Yeah. I think, Munther, one thing that I've seen in terms of some expressions of solidarity activism for Palestinian Christians is a focus exclusively on Palestinian Christians without actually seeing that that this affects everyone in the land, Palestinian Christians and Muslims, and also Israelis as well, and reaching for that larger story that's not just focused on one. But Bill, I'm wondering, I'm going to bring in Alan in a second. Bill, I know you have some resources that have been helpful with your learning. If there are others on this call who are in your position who have been awakened to a different way of seeing things, what are some things that they could read? Or if there are others who are resistant to some of this and still come from the perspective that you used to have when you were younger. You're on mute, Bill.
There we go. Thank you. Thanks, Greg. Yeah, I think we're going to put in the chat just one little brief article that I wrote on my admiration for Palestinian Christians, as well as a journal of one of the trips that I took to Israel with all the questions. It was a Telos trip, so in light of my background, in light of some of my experiences, and then what we saw and how I was processing that. So that's just a little overview of more narrative, I would say, as well as there's a beautiful article also about Palestinian Christians. And so I would say that one of the first things to do is simply to learn, simply to be open to learning more and more, and learning both in terms of people's stories, but then also the actual history and what's happened. And just to sort of, I suppose, commit to both awareness and not forgetting. It's really unfortunate that our imaginations are what's in our mind these days are so dominated by a news cycle, by somebody else deciding what it is that we should be concerned about or care about. And so just because we're not hearing about the plight of Palestinians, Christian and Muslim, does not mean that that's not going on. And so just that commitment to awareness and to staying mindful, I suppose, and sensitive. I'm sorry, Greg, what the question is, resources? Is that what we're talking about?
Yes. What resources would you recommend that people need if they want to go on a similar journey as yours? Okay. Yeah. So, because I do have a pretty clear answer to what can we do, but I'm not going to answer that at the moment. So I'm going to hold up a book here. This is super helpful. This is a helpful overview of the Holy Land, the Telos. You guys recommend this, The Israeli-Palestinian Conflict by Dale Hansen Bork. If it all feels really, really confusing, this is a really helpful and important guide. In terms of the journey of peacemaking, I've got to give a shout out to my brother Stu G and his book, Words from the Hill. And he's going to be, I believe, at one of your next seminars talking about that. So read Stu's book and get to know him. And I had a very unusual or an interesting angle on this, and that is that, this whole thing about peacemaking in Palestine, yes, of course, it's about understanding Palestine, but it's actually about being formed spiritually as the sort of person who is committed to peace and is becoming more of a person of love.
And you don't have to read a book about Israel-Palestine to become that sort of person. So actually, one thing I was going to recommend was, to find like a really good book by somebody who lives out this ethos of peace and love, neighbor love and enemy love. And so I would just recommend a book by Brother Roger. God is Love Alone. He's the founder of Tezé, who built a beautiful community that exemplifies peace and exemplifies harmony across differences. This has nothing to do with Israel and Palestine, except that actually it has everything to do with Israel and Palestine, because it's about becoming the sort of person that is a peacemaker, right? And then similarly to that, I would also recommend the sermons of Martin Luther King Jr. Strength to Love is a great compilation. I have a particular quote I'd like to put in the chat. His insights in all directions are just so good. And if we can like steep ourselves in his thought, we will become the sort of people that can hopefully bring some healing to places that are wounded.
Well, thank you for that, Bill. Alan, you have a question about some hopeful stories, and I want to put in a small plug for our podcast, Undaunted, Conversations with Radical Peacemakers. I think if you haven't engaged it, you'll love it. The first season is largely up, but it extends far beyond Israel-Palestine, and you have these wonderful encounters with people who have just remarkable stories of living these principles and practices out to give some hope. Alan, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, okay. Basically, I suppose I hear a lot of Christians talking about Palestinian Christians, and rightly so, because Palestinian Christians need to be a focus for us as a church in the West and that. But I kind of slightly kind of get a bit uneasy with that, because sometimes I think they need to leave out the word Christians and just say, I'm concerned about Palestinians full stop, because of how the Western church and the former Christian faith, and Zionism and so on has treated Palestinians as well as the Christians and so on. And I think like your ordinary Palestinian doesn't have the, how can I put it, the advantage of coming from a place of Christian faith or whatever. And so they might have deep in hatred in their heart towards Christians. And so how can we kind of begin to break that barrier down between the Christians and the Palestinians, the Palestinians who have that hate, because they must be, when they see how their land's been treated by largely a Christian idea, politically and religiously, they must be, the possibilities for peace must be really hard. But I guess Munther and others who've been involved far more than I have. I've been to the Holy Land once in my life, whatever, but people who've been involved more than I have can kind of tell us that it's not quite as dark as might seem, and there are works of Muslims and Christians and everything working for peace and reconciliation, and it's not an impossible task, and this can happen. So I'm just looking for some stories of hope and peace and things to encourage us all, really.
If I could respond quickly to that, I want to talk about why in this conversation I've talked so much about Palestinian Christians specifically. So just for the record, like I am for the Jewish people, and I'm for all Jewish people, and I'm for all Palestinian people, right? And so that's just true. It's deeply true. But in this specific conversation about Christianity in Palestine, in the Palestinian situation, I love talking about Palestinian Christians to Christians because Palestinian Christians are our brothers and sisters in Christ for real. We are the same family. And the Bible is explicitly clear. I'll just read it. Remember those who are in prison as though you're in prison with them, and those who are mistreated, since you are also in the body. The degree to which a Christian is able to empathize and engage with the plight of Palestinian Christians is actually demonstrates whether or not they want to obey their own Bible. Because we don't get to not care about Palestinian Christians very clearly. The rest is a broader conversation, but I can very confidently say this is why and I find this to be sometimes helpful in dealing with Christians, to say, let's not start with the Palestinians, everybody. Let's just start with those that we know we are obligated to, because we're in the same family. How are we going to remember them who are mistreated? Yeah, thanks.
Munther,
Yeah, a quick comment on that, and then to try to answer the question. On the one sense, I fully agree that, you know, it's to me, it's sad that there are so many Christians around the world, and I would say most Christians I met, who would not pay attention to the suffering of, or to our situation in Palestine and our narrative, if it was not for the fact that it was a Christian sharing that with them. And in the one sense, okay, I'm happy that at least they listen to us because we're Christians. But I don't think it should be so. I think we should be genuine as Christians to listening to all people, and accepting all, and respecting all people. And at the same time, one of the things I always say is that for many Christians around the world, maybe most evangelicals, there could be bombing of Gaza and people dying, and nobody would pay attention or feel sympathy. If one Christian is persecuted by Muslims, everybody will go crazy. And I say, that's wrong. We have no credibility if we only protest the death of Christians and ignore the killing of others. The same way, when everybody was troubled with the persecution of Christians in Iraq, and that's tragic, that's sad. But Yazidis were persecuted as well, and other Muslims were killed by Muslims as well. We should lament that, every life is valuable to God, and it shouldn't be that we only care for the suffering. I agree that on the one sense, as Christians, we should care for one another, but that should not stop. There. And at the same time, the question about good stories, Alan, there are many good stories, but we must also at the same time be careful to an important concept here, which is that, Alan, this is not a conflict between two equal sides, and where you have good people from both sides trying to come together and make for good stories. Because even meeting with Israelis is difficult for the majority of Palestinians. You need a permit to cross the wall to go to the other side and engage with Israelis. So daily encounters for the vast majority of us Palestinians in the West Bank, of course, I'm not talking about the ones in Galilee. The only way to encounter an Israeli, if it's either he or she is a soldier or a settler. So it becomes hard to build connections and stories. Now, despite that, there are beautiful stories of initiatives to fight the occupation, to bring peace together. Bereaved family is the first thing that comes to mind. Musala has a ministry of reconciliation that I'm involved in. There are many interfaith dialogues between Palestinians and Israelis, Jewish leaders and Palestinian Christian leaders, friendships that developed in these initiatives. So there are good things that are happening, but I would end with this comment. I hope we don't only see the good stories as in Palestinians and Israelis coming together, but as in also Palestinians and Israelis choosing the path of peace to challenge one another. In other words, for us using non-violence, and Israelis at the same time joining Palestinians in our non-violent struggle against the occupation. I think that these are the beautiful stories that we should highlight as well, when people are prophetically challenging, speaking truth to power and challenging the occupation together, Palestinians and Israelis who choose non-violence to act against the occupation.
Munther, thank you so much for that. I'm mindful that we're 1 minute over what we promised folks. So I just love if you could give us one last word, and then I'll close the call on some of the ways that you would like us to do that, whether and that we can continue to stay involved with your work and your mission, and ways in which many of us on the call can become active in ways that are meaningful and not just sort of rhetorical.
Yeah, no, thank you, Greg. You know, when people ask us or ask me, how can we pray for you, or what can we do for you? Here's how I like to respond. I'd like people to pray with us for peace, for the mission of the church, and to prevail in this land. And we'd like people to work with us, help us do what we're doing. If we truly believe that we're one body, then we should see ourselves as an extension of the other. And for that, at the one sense, I lament the fact that billions of dollars are invested from churches to settlement projects and to the Israeli army. Imagine if these money were invested in peace education, in peace initiatives. So join us in what we're doing, whether we are Palestinian Christian or secular peace activities, organizations, or interfaith. There are so many good things happening. Whether you support our schools, we have so many doing great things in our So yeah, let me share about our Lutheran schools. We're doing so many good things. The Bethlehem Bible College. We'd love for you to come and visit us when the pandemic is over. Whenever you visit the Holy Land, please come and worship with us on a Sunday. Hear about our activities, for example, at Christmas Lutheran Church, what we're doing through our outreach ministries. Right now, we're reaching out to so many people because of COVID-19, working with other churches and other Christian organizations. In other words, we're here, we're active, we're fulfilling the mission of Christ, preaching the gospel on a daily basis. And for our sisters and brothers, I hope you see us as an extension, or as we are one body, we're one kingdom. Many good things happening, and I'll be more than happy to share more in person later about our ministries. So we're busy in the kingdom work, and we hope people join us in that work as well.
And Munther, just one specific question. I know COVID-19 has been disruptive for everyone around the world, and many people here I'm actually in Ireland right now, but in the States where I live, have lost their jobs and are suffering financially. And yet many people are doing quite well. And is there, for those of us who are able, where can we put our resources? Just one footnote there, Bethlehem depends upon tourism. At the height of tourism, it already had a greater than 25% unemployment rate some years. So now the population there has really been devastated, given that the one source of economic influx is gone. How can we partner in this particular moment with you and your communities?
Yes, I mean, many families are falling apart because of this. And even, for those who could go work in Jerusalem, so far, Jerusalem is blocked. Not just, we need permits. Now we're not getting even the permits because of COVID-19. I don't think any news about permits being granted. Let me just say, Bethlehem Bible College, we have a humanitarian arm called the Shepherd Society. They're reaching out literally to hundreds of families. So that's one way, the Shepherd Society of Bethlehem Bible College. And also Christmas Lutheran Church, the church I pastor, we have created an emergency fund, and we're supporting a few families from our congregation, but also from the community. Please contact me personally if you would like to know more how to know. But both of us, the Shepherd Society and Christmas Lutheran, we're very engaged in helping families in these difficult days. And let's just hope that vaccine comes soon so that life goes back to normal.
Well, we can't wait to be together with you in person, Munther, soon. And thank you so much for taking time away from your family on this Advent evening. And Bill, thank you so much for joining us. We'll follow up with an email, which will include a link to all of the resources mentioned in this call, including Munther's suggestions to donate. We hope you'll sign up for Telos newsletters, the podcast, so you can participate in future conversations. I want to thank all of you for joining. And I do know this is a particularly uncertain time. But we do know this, whether or not we come from backgrounds of faith, is that the one constant in life is change. That's the one constant in human history. And we are authors, co-authors of the reality that we live in. And those of us, good people of goodwill, who may not always know the right thing to do, but are committed in earnestness to working together, are the force that has driven transformative and positive change for justice throughout the world. I'm going to recite a very small poem, and I promised to my colleagues at Telos to share it in DCAT and Carly. It's the last time they'll hear this. It's just a short few lines from Hafez, the 13th century Muslim Sufi poet. It says, the fool builds cages for everyone he knows, while the sage, who has to drop her head while the moon hangs low, keeps dropping keys all night long for all the beautiful, rowdy prisoners. And I think that's so appropriate for this moment. I first heard it from John Paul Lederach, the great Mennonite peacemaker, because it highlights the reality of the world and our role. The reality is that story is both cage and key. Story is what allows us to talk about those people, them, to define them as terrorists, to ignore them. It's a cage that makes prisoners out of others. But story is also a key that allows us to see the humanity and the quality of the other and the unfair circumstances that they live in that can ultimately help us liberate one another. And so our role, I think, in these dark days is to follow Munther's lead with prophetic imagination and to figure out how we can cast new stories and do that not just with our words and our imaginations, but with our resources and our bodies and all of our energies, and most importantly, each other. So to all of you, thank you so much for joining. We have an opportunity together. Let us work together to seize it. Happy holidays, Merry Christmas to all of you, and hopefully we'll see you next week with Stu G and Todd Deathridge and Sammy Awad from Bethlehem. Thank you all.